Hello. In the last video, we discussed ways that the federal government raises revenue. Now we're going to turn our attention to expenditures, or the ways that the government spends money. The federal government spends around $4 trillion a year, and most years that number increases. One reason is that the government has to deal with something called entitlement spending. Entitlements are programs that spend money to give benefits to people according to set formulas. Many of these programs were first established as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and have been expanded or altered since then. The government is required by law to make these payments. It can't set a cap or say something like, we're only going to spend $500 billion on Social Security and then we're going to stop. The only way to spend less money on these programs is to change the laws so that the formulas are less generous. Members of Congress don't usually like to do this because it tends to make the voters who receive those benefits a bit miffed, which can have negative results come election time. That doesn't mean that no one ever wants to change the formulas or no one ever wants to reduce these benefits. Some members of Congress and some people in the government do, but it tends to be a hard thing to get done. In fact, when push comes to shove, most members of Congress don't really like to cut spending of any kind, because whatever the government spends, there's a group of voters that likes that spending. There are exceptions, especially on the conservative side of the political spectrum, but for the most part, you can make a pretty safe bet that next year the government will either spend the same amount as it did this year, or maybe a little bit more to account for inflation. This practice of setting a budget by starting from the previous year and then making small changes is called incrementalism. In some cases, Congress doesn't really have much of a choice about how much money to spend. As we said, Congress can't decide to spend less money on entitlements in a given year unless it changes the formula in the underlying law. And if the U.S. government borrowed money last year, Congress can't refuse to pay the interest this year unless Congress wants to provoke a major global economic crisis. Because if the United States starts saying, no, we're not going to pay back what we borrowed, then pretty much everyone around the world is going to panic and the results are not going to be pretty for anybody. So these types of spending are known as uncontrollable spending. These amounts are basically locked in when Congress tries to pass a budget for the year, and Congress must build the budget around them. We're going to talk more about the process of building the budget now, and I have to ask your indulgence. The textbook and lots of other sources explain how the budget process is supposed to work each year, and it's important to know how the system is set up to work. We're going to go over that. But you also need to know that the system has broken down a lot over the last decade or so, and it's very rare that Congress and the President actually follow the textbook. So we're also going to discuss the way that the budget has actually gotten passed lately. Okay, here's how it's supposed to work. In February, the President makes a budget proposal to Congress. You may remember that we discussed the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, when we talked about the executive branch. Well, this budget proposal is one of the things that the OMB helps to put together. But remember, it's not the President who ultimately decides how to spend the nation's money. It's Congress. Congress has the power of the purse. The budget committees of each chamber work on their own general idea for a budget. This works its way through the normal legislative system until both chambers have a budget they can agree on, and that's called a budget resolution. Now, the budget resolution is not the actual authorization to spend money. It's just a statement of how much money the Congress intends to authorize to spend and where that money is supposed to come from. In other words, it's non-binding. But it sets a target, and here's why the target is important. It might be necessary to change laws in order to meet those targets. Maybe the target calls for more revenue, so taxes have to be raised. Or less revenue, so taxes have to be cut. Or maybe the target calls for less money to be spent on Medicare, so the Medicare formula has to be changed. These changes to the laws can be made in a special type of bill called a budget reconciliation. Now, here's an important detail about budget reconciliation bills. They can't be filibustered in the Senate, so it can be passed with a bare majority of the Senate. In 2017, the Senate tried to use a budget reconciliation bill to change or repeal parts of the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare health law. That way, the Senate would only need 50 Republican senators to vote for the plan, instead of needing Democrats to help them get cloture if it were a normal bill. Now, the Republicans in the Senate wound up one vote short when a few Republicans refused to go along. But budget reconciliation is the reason why they were close in the first place. Now, once the budget and the budget reconciliation are passed, then each relevant standing committee in Congress works on an appropriations bill, which has the detailed instructions and authorizations regarding exactly what the government is supposed to spend. There are supposed to be like 13 of these bills passed by Congress and then signed by the president. At that point, the budget is set, and the U.S. government can spend money for another year. It's a lengthy, complicated, but reasonable sounding process, and our government hasn't followed it for years. Once Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in 2011, Congress pretty much ignored President Obama's budget proposals because House Republicans had very different ideas about what government should do. President Trump has not offered a full budget proposal, but he did offer an outline or summary of his priorities, and the Republicans in Congress said they weren't going to pass those either, because they had their own ideas. But oftentimes the House and Senate can't agree on a budget resolution either, so many times they don't pass one, which means that somewhere around the end of September, the government has a deadline. If Congress can't pass new instructions on spending money, the government can't spend anything, which would mean the government basically shuts down. So in order to avoid this, Congress has usually passed a bill called a continuing resolution, which basically says, keep doing what we were doing until we figure out a new plan. Then the president signs the continuing resolution, and the government stays open, but the arguments continue. Now, sometimes the continuing resolution has a modification. Occasionally, the parties will get together and they will make an agreement that replaces the continuing resolution for a period of time, but it often tends to be messy. Each individual year has had individual quirks, but this is the basic way that the government has been funded for many of the last several years. And as I record this, it looks like something similar is going to be needed to keep the government running, at the end of September or early October 2018. That hopefully gives you some idea of what the budget process looks like and how Congress decides to spend the government's money. That'll wrap up this series on the budget. And until the next series, I'll leave you with these questions for thought and discussion. Thank you.